July the 2nd, 1997 is a day that I will never forget. On July the 1st of that year, China took back Hong Kong and set that day as a public holiday to celebrate. When I went back to work on July the 2nd, one of my colleagues put a set of books on my desk and said, "Here you are, Zhuan Falun." It was a package posted from Mianyang by my sister. The wrapping paper was already broken. That was why my colleague was able to see the title of the book. I had liked to read very much since I was a child. When I was studying in university, I read books of all sorts of topics, including philosophy, religion, supernormal capabilities, Qigong, the Book of Changes, and so on. I studied almost everything. On the one hand, I believed that there must be some ultimate truth in the universe for it to maintain stability and harmony, and I wanted to know what that ultimate truth was. On the other hand, I was very much puzzled about what people should do with their lives. Shall we just live for the sake of living, pursue fame, self-interest, and honor, and then just wait to die? Most of the time, I didn't know which path to follow. I didn't want to fight my way up by all sorts of means, like many others around me were doing. I felt that path would be too tiring, and it was totally against my nature. However, I also didn't want to lag behind, be bullied or looked down upon by others as a result of not striving hard enough. I didn't know what to follow or what to adhere to, and was bewildered most of the time. My success on the surface might have looked glorious for others, yet it couldn't in the least solve the problems within my own heart. To make things worse, I encountered a medical accident and experienced too severe hemorrhage when I gave birth to my daughter, and the blood transfusion caused me to contract hepatitis C, which is incurable. After that, life felt like an endless sinking into a bottomless pit of despair. I had to lie down in the hospital for years without being able to look after my daughter or even being able to witness her growth. In early 1997, I decided that I would not be enslaved by my diseases anymore and went back to work. I had worked just for 1 year when I was knocked down by my poor health. Women are usually likened to flowers, and I felt like a withered flower cast down to the ground overnight. I didn't want to bury my remaining life inside a hospital, no matter how long that life could be. I wanted to pretend that everything was normal, and I wished to live a normal life. That was, after all, just a wishful thought. In reality, my life was more tiring than that of Lin Daiyu, one of the mistresses of Dream of the Red Chamber, who dared not make any mistakes. While Lin was afraid of being ridiculed by others in an unfamiliar environment as a helpless orphan who had to rely on her relatives, I was afraid of being humiliated by my diseases. I was so weak that whenever I wasn't careful enough, or whenever there was some kind of epidemic disease around, such as the flu, I would always be the first to be knocked down. Therefore, in July 1997, after having experienced so much, I really didn't believe that anything would help me anymore. So I opened the book Zhuan Falun half-heartedly and with an absent mind. However, when I reached page 4, when the origin of human life was revealed, I suddenly felt being strongly grasped by the content. From then on, I didn't have any time to make any judgment about any remaining part of the book. Instead, I hurriedly finished all the 4 books my sister posted to me in one go, which had me explaining again and again while reading, "Oh my God, so it is like this." I could say that the inspiration Zhuan Falun brought to me was much greater than all the other books I had read combined together. I found answers to all my questions about life, the cosmos, and even human society. I was no longer puzzled and had gained an understanding about the purpose of my coming to this world. I immediately decided to practice Falun Gong. I also learned that my mother and sister had been practicing Falun Gong for about 1 month through the introduction of a friend. They felt the practice was very wonderful and so eagerly mailed the set of books to me. My mother and youngest sister were only able to move to Mianyang and joined my father and eldest sister after I had left home for university. In order to be able to move to Mianyang, my mother had to give up her nearly 30 years career as a teacher, as well as the so-called merit payment based on the length of teaching, which was not a small figure for her, as none of the schools in Mianyang City would accept her due to lack of permission to hire. After my parents' many years' efforts and begging for help, the leaders of the judicial system finally agreed to help and to resolve this issue internally. As a result, my mother was finally given a position at the Mianyang Intermediate Court and started off as a court clerk, the lowest level position within the court. I always admired my mother for her toughness. As a middle-aged woman in her 40s, in order to live together with the family, she was not only brave enough to start a new career from the entrance level, but was also brave enough to become a college student like her daughter. The only difference was, while I was studying in a normal university, she was studying in the amateur open national adult college for court cadres. My mother worked very hard. It was not that easy for her, and her memory wasn't as good as younger people. However, she did very well and successfully graduated several years later. This not only made up for the humiliation she had suffered for not being allowed to go to college because of her bad social class category, but also enabled her to gradually be promoted from a clerk to a judge and finally a chief judge. In 1997, my 64-year-old father had already retired. When my mother and sister first started practicing Falun Gong, he didn't follow along, nor did he believe in it. However, he went to the park with them. While my mother and sister practiced the Falun Gong exercises, he went to do ballroom dancing as a form of exercise. He had become obsessed with dancing ever since he retired. One day, after finished dancing, my mother and sister were still doing their Falun Gong exercises, so he stood there and waited. Suddenly, he saw a huge Falun, which should be invisible in another dimension, as big as a swimming pool. He was completely shocked. Amazed by the seeing is believing thing he observed, he began devoting himself to the practice of Falun Gong as well. He often shared with us what he had seen with his third eye. When he practiced the third Falun Gong exercises, he could see a cluster of small Faluns moving together with his arms. He said that he called it a cluster as they look exactly the way copper coins used in old times were strung together. When talking about this, my father looked as happy and as innocent as a child who was sharing his secrets. My sister and I agreed that father's third eye was open because he had a sight of well-preserved nature that had not been polluted. It was also the reason why he could see many supernormal things as soon as, or even before, he started practicing. After a period of time, my father especially called and told me that his presbyopia farsightedness had gone. He said that although he had officially retired, he was still invited to work for the law firm on some cases. One day, he saw many tiny pieces of paper on the table in his office while he was cleaning it, and thought to himself, who would have cut the newspaper into such small scraps? Suddenly he found that he could see clearly the tiny characters on the classified advertisement. Those characters were so small that he could absolutely not see clearly. Without his presbyopic glasses before, how could he suddenly see so clearly without his glasses? He thought it was just temporary, so he dared not tell anybody. He tested himself on the following day to see if he could still see those tiny characters clearly without glasses, and yes, he could. He tested himself continuously for 2 weeks until he was sure that he could now get rid of the presbyopic glasses. He only called me and told me this good news after he was 100% sure of the fact. However, after he happily shared this good news with me, he added very seriously that as a cultivator of Falun Gong, one should not develop any attachment and should not show off or become too complacent. Therefore, he didn't go boasting about this everywhere. Actually, he only ever revealed this in private to family members and the assistant at his practice site. Getting rid of presbyopia was just one of the wonderful things that happened to my father after he practiced Falun Gong. For example, his blood pressure had been very high for years, with the systolic pressure often higher than 200. He had been relying on hypertension to maintain his blood pressure, but dangerous things still often happened. Once both he and my mother went out on bicycles. While my mother was riding behind my father, she suddenly saw him fall off his bicycle and drop onto the ground. My mother was scared to death. My father had passed out while riding because his blood pressure was too high. Since then, my mother never allowed him to ride a bicycle again. However, my father's blood pressure soon returned to normal after he practiced Falun Gong, and he no longer needed any hypertension. Many other diseases, including chronic pharyngitis and nasal sinusitis, all disappeared as well. In the summer of 1998, I traveled from Beijing to Sichuan with my daughter to visit my parents. I was extremely surprised when I set sight on my father, who was waiting for us at the platform of the train station, as he looked at least 10 years younger. In my memory, my father had always been skin and bones and had never put on any weight. As a result, his wrinkles were very deep. He also started going bald as early as in his 30s, and children started calling him grandpa when he was less than 40 years old. He always mocked himself about this. After practicing Falun Gong, he had put on at least 10 kilograms, or about 22 pounds. As a result, his wrinkles became much less obvious. That's why he looked 10 years younger when I saw him. After staying with my parents for 2 days, I noticed another very important change that had happened to my father, which was the way he walked. There was a scene in Thomas Hardy's novel Tales of the D'Urbervilles, which impressed me very much. The bad guy in the book, Alec d'Urberville, who raped Tess years ago, later became a priest. Once, while he was preaching, Tess, who was among the congregation, suddenly saw and recognized him. At that time, they had not seen each other for about 4 years. It was obvious that Alec didn't recognize Tess yet, with her appearance and outfit having changed. She wanted to walk away quietly, but the moment that she moved again, he recognized her. From this scene, we learned that the way one walks carries more of a person's characteristic than his or her appearance and outfit. Therefore, that's why I was so surprised when I saw the way my father walked after he practiced Falun Gong for just 1 year. His steps were completely different. They were no longer heavy, slow, or sloppy like an old man's. Instead, they became swift and as light as a swallow. I could see that even he himself had not realized this change. Only his family members who were very familiar with everything of his could notice this change at first sight. And this kind of change could only happen when great changes had occurred at very deep levels, levels more microscopic than the level of his body's physical cells. I also observed 2 photos underneath the glass of my father's desk. One was taken before he practiced Falun Gong, in which he looked very old and as thin as a skeleton. The other one was taken after he practiced Falun Gong, in which he was meditating with very straight back and with fair, radiant, and full cheeks. Besides these 2 photos was a poem he had written. I remember the last line was, "Forever charging forward despite all the odds and hardships." He wrote that poem to show his determination to cultivate until the very end. He said, whenever there were visitors at home, he would definitely show them the 2 photos as the best evidence to show Falun Gong's benefits. I had never seen a happier, prouder, and more talkative father. During that summer, father had talked far more than in his entire life before.